Okay, my name, I should start off with what I always start off with, and that is g'day. My name is Ian Grieve. I'm an amateur radio historian specialising in Australian old-time radio, 1920s to 1960s. Most of the people in the old-time radio hobby know me and know to contact me if there's any sort of an Australian link to either a US show they believe came to Australia, or they find something that they believe may be Australian. And I do my best to answer questions. You want some more mic?
Not allowed to move.
So, personally, I have an extensive collection of radio newspapers and magazines because, unlike here, nothing's online. We have the National Library has the Trove collection of newspapers, and that's about it. Everything else is in institutions or in private hands. So I collect the Australian radio transcription discs and all the memorabilia associated with the shows and the people and all the rest of it. And that's what I do. I just love researching. So with Australia, the first licensed commercial radio station in Australia was a 500-watt transmitter with the Callstein 2SB in November 1923. This was closely followed by a 5,000-watt 2FC Sydney a couple of weeks later. In 1924, several Melbourne stations commenced, namely 3AR on the 26th of January and 3LO on the 13th of October. You need to remember that the 1924 Australian population of 5.6 million is roughly the same as New York at the time, and we've kept pace with New York all the way through. So if you think of the population in New York, that's the population in Australia. Change a few things. Where we go. That's usually how they see Australia from here. But it's actually more like that. Okay, so at this point I explained our system of call signs. You guys seem to have 4 letters and all the rest of it. Our call signs used in Australia is very basic, 3 characters, and the first is a number which identifies the state. And then 2 letters. Quite often the letters are either denoting the town that the station is in, or the owners of the station. But that's how easy it is. Okay, our listeners were licensed, so you had to have a listener's license. I mentioned that 2SB and 2FC were licensed. In order to fund wireless, because of our small size, an annual licence fee of 10 shillings was imposed by the government on listeners. At the time these stations commenced, there were approximately 1,400 licensed listeners. Radio stations in 1924 were divided into A, B and C class stations. A class stations received the lion's share of the listeners' licence fees. B class received no portion as they were deemed to be self-supporting through the use of advertising. They were your commercial stations. C class was supposed to be sponsored, but they never ever issued C class licences. In 1928, the Australian government announced that they would buy all the A class stations and create a national broadcaster. In July 1932, the Australian Broadcasting Commission, ABC, commenced and is still government owned today. The listener licence system continued in Australia and of course increased in cost at various times, and was joined by a viewer's licence after television commenced in Australia in 1956. The licences would then be combined in later years, and the licensing wasn't phased out until 1974. One thing that licensing did create that has lasted, and that is commercial radio's hatred of the ABC, which is of course pulsed through the veins of commercial television versus ABC television. Murdoch still wants to kill off the ABC. You guys know about Mr. Murdoch. In 1935, the emergence of recording performances and later 1930s heralding the beginning of distribution of these performances, the time was right for forming networks. Each of those networks had a key station in the major capital cities to attract the regional stations with the added purchasing power of shows they might not otherwise have been able to afford, as well as attracting advertisers outside their local area, particularly national advertisers. Wireless content kicked off with music and information as well as dramatic performances, either live within studios or live on the stage and relayed. In Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth and Hobart, we see the same growth of stations and the need for content. The larger stations form partnerships with local acting groups and form their own players to regularly write and perform live on air. Early radio drama and comedy had a fair percentage of influence from British music hall traditions. There was a healthy stage circuit with several competing groups bringing acts between England and Australia. Those music hall traditions were still in influence on Australian radio and then television well into the 1960s. And somewhere along the line I missed a click. So we have a few giveaway cards that come from my collection here. And a few of the stations. So in 1936, was it? 96 stations? 1939, 96 stations. Okay, so our next slide. There we go. So this is where Australia is a little bit different from the rest of the world. You might not know him, but that's a kookaburra. Now, the kookaburra, right from the beginning of Australian radio, the kookaburra was used to start the day's programs. Not a bad alarm clock. In Melbourne pre-recording era, up to 15 different kookaburras were used at different stations. And that's what you wake up to in the mornings. In fact, if you're lucky, you still wake up like that anyway, even without radio. But that's a good alarm clock, I reckon. Okay, so then we have, I've got a little recording here of a fellow by the name of Roy Reen. Roy Reen Mo was Australia's Prime Minister of Mirth. I could spend hours on Mo alone. He was extremely popular, he and his pathos. He had the reputation in the early days of being blue, meaning his jokes and skits were colourful and a bit crude. Here's an example. Here's an example after I hit the button.
The barmaid of the butcher. The barmaid and the butcher. Hey, you! Oh, Friday, here again. The girl was 37, and she worked in a pub called the Lion's Head.
Well, I'd never heard of that. Where's the lion's head?
About 6 feet in front of its tail.
Your jokes kill me.
Yeah, I wish I could think of a few more parts. The barmaid and the butcher.
Hey, listen, is this all about the barmaid? When does the butcher come in?
Every night about 5 to 6.
And what's his name?
Oh dear, that's funny. I can't think of his name, but I have it on the tip of my tongue.
Oh, well, I know where the tip of your tongue is.
Where?
About 6 feet behind your nose.
Oh, strike me lucky, that's monstrous.
You're telling me.
The barmaid and the butcher. Oh, now I remember the butcher's name. It's the same as mine.
Ah, Bugleby.
Now listen up, I'll have you know that my nose has been described as a delicate little organ.
Delicate little organ.
Yeah.
Looks more like a great big whale, it does.
I'll ignore that. The barmaid and the butcher.
That was Mo. Mo. Yeah. Sorry about that. I've got no way of increasing the sound from what it's playing here at the moment. We got another microphone? Okay. We've got a little while before we get some more audio, I think. So I'll start playing. US transcribed shows have started to be heard on Australian radio. Some I've been researching recently are. Now, those of you who recognise some of those names?
Could you read it out loud, please? I'm learning.
Okay, me too. Okay, so we've got Bringing Up Father, Tarzan.
You're going to have to go somehow by the microphone when you turn in.
Okay, Bring Up Father, Tarzan, Black Ghost, Black Magic, Ebb and Zeb, Witch's Tale, Moon Over Africa, Strange as It Seems, Ports of Call, Deer Slayer, Detective Dalton Zumba, Pinto Pete and His Ranch Boys, Album of Life, Black Flame of the Amazon, Cavalcade of Drama, Cinnamon Bear, Crime Does Not Pay, Frontier Fighters, Ghost Corpse, Green Joker, Heartstrings, Hollywood's Casting Office, Jerry of the Circus, Joe and Cynthia, Magic Island, Mama Bloom Brood, Memories of Hawaii, Metropolis, Mutiny on the High Seas, Shamrocks, Strange Wills, That Was the Year, The Lone Ranger, was that Tina and Tim, Thrills from Great Operas, Yogi Jorgensen, Your Hymns and Mine, Wings of the Morning, Crimson Trail, Frank and Archie, and Beyond Reasonable Doubt, which I just added this week for some reason. I got someone inquiring about that one. These are shows that I've been sort of working on just recently. I don't usually do American shows, only when someone actually contacts me and says, hey, was this show in Australia? Or can you tell me a bit more about it? I'll just hit you for some ads. Now, unfortunately, the people with sight problems, this is very visual. Later on, I've got some recordings, but I'm playing a lot of ads from the shows themselves. From the newspapers. It gives you an idea of what actually did come to Australia that was US.
All of these are from transcriptions?
All of these came to Australia on transcription, yeah. This is pre-1940s.
So there'd be no major network stations in that?
No.
You just saw they're all apart from
They're all coming out individually.
Lone Ranger was obviously a bigger network, but not NBC or CBS.
Lone Ranger money.
Maybe I did an extra click there. Now, here we go. Australian early shows. All the Australian performances, apart from music from records, imports and experimental recordings, were live until Australian radio producers started to record to 16-inch radio transcription discs around 1935, with AWA in Sydney making its first recording of family comedy Fred and Maggie, which had been live on 2CH Sydney up to that point. By 1951, Fred and Maggie had entertained Australians for more than 1,500 quarter-hour episodes. The two major centres of radio production were Sydney and Melbourne. Other capital cities, regional cities and towns were producing radio programs on transcription as well as live shows. However, the population base of Sydney and Melbourne certainly gravitated the acting and production services, and the rest followed. However, one series, Yes What, broke the mould. This was an Adelaide, South Australian series which has remained popular for over 80 years. Based on the English comedy skits and the classroom antics of Will Hay, as soon as my wife Dawn, she doesn't know much about old-time radio, but as soon as she heard the opening sounds from Yes What, she knew exactly what the series was. Now, most of this stuff was all within Australia. Hardly anything went overseas. Enemy Within was sent over to the US, but I don't know. I haven't seen any record of it actually being broadcast. Can you hear this?
Oh, well, good morning, boys. Good morning, sir. Good morning, boys. Right, now take out pencils and papers. Pencils and papers? Don't argue. Just do what you're told. We're going to do arithmetic.
Why, sir?
Why? Because you know nothing whatever about it, that's why. And today I'm going to make quite sure that Greenbottle doesn't explain any of his methods of working to us. Yes, Bottomley O. What little work we did last lesson was just ruined by that idiot proving something that couldn't possibly be right. He explained the method he used. All right, I know what he did. Using Greenbottle's method is perfectly easy to prove that 17 is 125.
How, sir?
Well, first you've to... No! Listen, will you stop asking questions and start to concentrate a little more on your work?
Yes.
Right, well now look at the blackboard.
Yes.
Right. The first problem there is the one that we attempted last lesson, but for which we got no answer at all. And before we start today, we're going to work that one out. Ow! Oh! I'd just like you to understand, Bottomley, that I've quite made up my mind to see that law and order is maintained in this classroom. And I'm also determined that each day we'll get through the work that I schedule. So the sooner we start, the sooner we finish.
Yes.
Right, read that problem, Stan. Put the first one there.
If a man walks at the rate of 8 miles an hour, how far will he be from a town 25 miles away after he's walked for 2 hours?
Right, well now that's the problem you couldn't or wouldn't do last lesson. There are two towns, 25 miles apart. This man walks from one to the other. He walks at the rate of 8 miles an hour. How far will he be from the town he's approaching after he's been walking for 2 hours?
Yeah.
Well, go on now, that's perfectly simple. If you can't work it out in your heads, you can use your pencils and papers. But it's perfectly simple, and you should be able to do it mentally.
Right, that's hard, sir.
Rubbish, it's elementary. But regardless of what you think it is, do it.
Yes.
Oh. And you too, Bottomley.
Oh, me as well?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were talking to Stanford.
Oh, did you? Well, I wasn't.
Don't I have to do it, sir?
No, Bottomley, down. Yes, of course you have to do it.
I thought you said you weren't speaking of me.
No, yes, I was. I didn't say that.
Yes, you did. I asked you if
Bottomley.
Yeah?
I want you both to work out that problem. Yes, how? And hurry up about it, too.
Yes.
We can't waste too much time over this. The man has got to travel 25 miles between those two places. He travels at 8 miles per hour.
What's the name of the places, sir?
Well, the first place is... What? It doesn't matter what the names of the places are.
No, but it might make it easier.
Yeah. Easier? How?
Well, if the two places I'm thinking of, I know a shortcut.
Do you?
Yeah, it cuts off 5 miles.
Oh, well, he probably went that way. No! Wait a minute. Bottomley. But that's got nothing to do with the problem at all. We'll just assume that they're not the two towns you're thinking of.
Well, what towns are they, sir?
I don't know.
Well, it might be the towns I'm thinking of.
Yes, it might be.
Oh, well, I will take the shortcut.
Will you?
Sure.
Good on you. No, there's your right, Bottomley. If you intend to persist with this nonsense, I'll persist with this punishment. You know as well as I do that the name of the town is immaterial.
Where's that, sir?
Where's what?
Immaterial.
It's on the coast road as you come... No! Stanford, are you trying to be funny?
No, sir.
Well, stop asking ridiculous questions. Immaterial is not the name of a town.
Rightio. I sort of went to that school, I think. Okay. Some of the major labels of 1937-8 were, and it's quite a long list. But you guys only hear about, I know, about 4 or 5 different labels that came out of Australia to the US, but the number of actual labels were considerable. These are just some from my collection. So as you saw, there are many Australian production houses, but in this talk I'm only going to concentrate on the biggest ones who are known to US collectors because they exported their titles to the US and or imported shows from the US. Here we go, Artranza. In 1933, A.E. Bennett of radio station 2GB travelled to the US to buy radio programs on transcription disc. He visited Transco, and Grace Gibson was the person who showed him around, and he bought everything they had. She took him to other transcription companies, and he did the same, bought everything he could. He then returned to Australia. Shortly afterwards, Grace Gibson was offered the job to start up a production and distribution arm of 2GB with what was later called Artranza. Grace was given a return ticket to Australia and a 6-month contract. Grace Gibson returned to America for short visits several times, but when she returned to America in 1941, it was the day before Pearl Harbor, and due to difficulty with shipping berths in time of war, Grace remained in America as Managing Director of Transco. Okay. Rightio, so then we move on to November 1939. In November 1939, the Australian government announced trade bans with non-sterling countries to take effect from January 1940. The idea was currency protection, keep the US dollars for essential goods. The bans stayed in effect until the early 1950s. Without the dumping of US programs on the Australian market, the Australian radio industry boomed and production houses multiplied. Why was it referred to as dumping? Because the full Australian rights for US shows prior to the ban were as little as $2 an episode for a 52-episode series. The shows had already made their money in the US market. In Australia, the episode would be sold to a sponsor for between $10 or $20 per episode, and the shows could be repeated 2 or 3 times and sometimes more. Somebody was making a profit. The Australian actors, musicians and scriptwriters were naturally concerned that they would not be able to compete with the cheap imports and wanted the ban maintained even after the end of the war. There was one exception to the ban on American radio transcription discs, and that exception was Armed Forces radio service. During World War II, American forces were stationed in Australia. The Australian government wanted to supply entertainment from home, and so negotiations were held for US shows to be imported by the military. The Melbourne newspapers reported this from 1941, and it was quite a war on its own. The idea was on, off, on again, off again, until it was finally definitely on again. It was decided to put certain hours aside each evening on both commercial radio and the national broadcaster ABC. A ballot was held and the shows were split between stations. Then the real fighting began. The ABC was publicly funded and wasn't allowed to advertise, so the commercial stations complained about the ABC broadcasting shows that had embedded advertising. ABC in turn complained about how the commercial stations were making money from transcribed shows where the artists had donated their talents for free. Word made it back to APRA in the US, and they sent somebody out to investigate what was going on. The entertainment stopped. So did the transcribed shows. The experiment lasted less than 3 months. The ban on American transcription imports didn't stop Australians from listening to American shows. Shortwave had a huge following in Australia, and entertainment magazines and newspapers printed details of what stations could be picked up and even what shows were on at those times. Okay, just to finish off the Artransa story. Currently with my research, I show that over 30 years, Artransa was responsible for almost 600 radio serials, just as many exported to the US as imported. Now here's the one that everybody knows about, George Edwards Productions. In Sydney, actor George Edwards had teamed up with the EMI and Sydney station 2UW, and his first recordings were in May 1935. The partnership with EMI, George Edwards Productions and Columbia Records grew to a massive amount of output each week. By 1938, George Edwards was being broadcast on 72 commercial stations Australia-wide. For George Edwards to be on 72 stations at a time when there were only about 96 stations, he had to have been in every radio market in Australia and maybe even on more than one station in the same city. It's an amazing feat. Some more amazing George Edwards statistics are that he produced over 200 complete serials by 1942, each averaging 52 episodes, making a total of 10,000 quarter hours, and by 1947 that had doubled to 20,000 quarter hours. I've documented over 268 series and serials from George Edwards Productions from 1931 to 53, plus there were productions he did for 2GB and 2UE, which I would estimate would total about 400 series serials and probably close to about 30,000 quarter-hour episodes. Grace Gibson Productions.
Hello again. I'm Grace Gibson. Tonight I have a special treat for you, and that is our production of Dragnet. This series was one of the best radio and TV shows ever produced, here or in America. Our production was made in 1952 from American Scripts. In the lead as Joe Friday, we starred Frank Waters. In America, Jack Webb played the lead in the radio and TV series and became one of the big stars of Hollywood. The unusual theme music in Dragnet was on the hit parade for a long time. The scripts were written in such a way that the emphasis was placed on the actors playing their parts naturally, just like ordinary people. This style is still popular today, but Dragnet was the first. I've selected the episode you're about to hear for a number of reasons. It is a perfect example of the Dragnet style. It's topical because Christmas is really just around the corner. And it's one of the saddest, most moving stories I've ever heard. It is called A Rifle for Christmas.
So I don't know if anyone's ever heard Grace's voice before. That was towards the end of her life. So Grace returned to Australia in 1944 to get married and started Grace Gibson Radio Productions. Grace had the contacts in the US due to her time at Transco and inside knowledge of the industry. She was very successful in the male-dominated business, and she knew what would be successful and what wouldn't. You can see some nice ads going through at the moment. Grace produced over 200 serials, resulting in over 32,480 episodes by my current accounting. The final figure will probably get to around 60,000. Some of her series and serials were very long-running. Drama of Medicine commenced in 1945 and ran for 768 episodes and was exported all over the world. Dr. Paul was 4,634 episodes. Aunt Mary, 1,724, whereas in the US it was only 604 episodes. Nightbeat was 442 episodes, in the US is about 120. Life Can Be Beautiful, 1,664 episodes. Portia Faces Life, 3,544 episodes, and the popular character of Portia Manning was also in several spin-off series. There were quite a few other series that ran in excess of 1,000 episodes. When a series was popular, Grace kept it going. In 1983, Castle Ray Line, a story about Cobb & Co-style stagecoach line, commenced. Radio station manager said nobody wanted to listen to serials anymore, but station 2KY in Sydney decided to run it. It actually ran for 910 episodes and was one of the most popular serials that Grace Gibson Productions ever produced. It was broadcast all over Australia and still broadcast in Sydney on 2CH up until last year, twice a day. As soon as the series finished, listeners would ring in and beg for it to be played again from the beginning because they missed some episodes. It's certainly one of my favourites and was released as a set of books by scriptwriter Ross Napier. You can order that series online too, and also the books from Grace Gibson Productions if you get a chance. Here's some Australian shows from 1940. You look at these ads and you just think, geez, I wish I could listen to that. Okay, I have some more US shows. It sounds a bit funny in this because it's an actual air check.
Book 15, Chapter 7 of One Man's Family, a Shadowton under Brandy broadcast, a worldwide triumph in radio, written by Carlton E. Morse. One Man's Family is dedicated to the mothers and fathers of the younger generation and to their bewildering offspring. Tonight we bring you Episode 7, Book 15, entitled Further Problems of Clifford. And here is how things are with the Barbers. Besides losing Beth Holly to a man named Philip Spencer, Paul has, in the last few weeks, met with 2 minor accidents, one in a training plane and the other in his car. And to add to this unpleasantness, he now discovers Beth is not at all happy with their new marriage. Claudia and Nicky are busily developing the Sky Farm, and that's about all we hear of them for the moment. Clifford was elated when his mother made the first friendly gesture to Marion Galloway by sending her flowers, and sitting on top of the world when she followed it up with an invitation to tea. But all the lights went out of the world when his father called him into his office and told him no man could be a good businessman unless he had initiative. He fired him on the spot and told him to go out and develop that golden quality. In a mood of reprisal, he asked Marion to marry him, and the two of them would live their own life. But Marion talked him back into a reasonable frame of mind. And now we find the entire Barber clan gathering at the Herbert farm for the week's end.
I mean, that's quite an introduction. One Man's Family is mainly in the early days of Australian radio and was live. There were players in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, all broadcasting the series. It was hugely popular. Carlton E. Morse is quoted in Australian newspapers several times with regard to